This is the first lecture for the Kent School District's Advanced Java course. My name is Al Waltner and I'll be leading you through the following topics. We'll be discussing, once again, a review of what is Java. You should already know what Java is because you've used it already, but we'll discuss some of the specific features of the programming language. We'll also talk about what a GUI application is and what an object-oriented program is compared to, say, a console application. We'll also be discussing the quick Java rules review just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we'll have the structure of a GUI application and how to build a GUI application. All right. Then you'll follow along and enter code to create a simple JFrame application. You'll be surprised. It does take a lot of code just to make a simple program, so do your best to keep up. And then we'll review the assignments that you'll be doing for Lesson 1. So let's get started. First of all, what is Java? Well, Java, you've probably heard the term, is a platform-independent programming language. As you know, there's many different devices out there running all different types of operating systems. Well, in the old days, what you would have to do is create a different version of your program for every single type of operating system. So Java took advantage of the internet and the ability to access all those different devices through one source. And what it does is it creates what's called bytecode. Bytecode isn't an actual running version of the program. Instead, what it does is it passes that information to the operating system's runtime environment. All right? If your operating system has the Java runtime environment installed on it, then you can run a Java program written for any operating system. Java is also an object-oriented programming language. Most modern programming languages are object-oriented because it makes it much easier to build code. The reason it's easier is that the whole concept of trying to keep track of a lot of data is much simpler if we can think of it in terms of one single object. For example, think of a student. It's pretty easy to figure out all the different variables I would need to store for one single student. But how would I do that for all the students in the Kent School District? Right? That would be much more difficult. But if I simply kept track of them and encapsulated the data in a single object, then it would be simple just to create multiple versions of that one object. Another reason Java is pretty popular is that it's fairly easy to learn. Does that mean it's easy? No. All right. But it's relatively easy to learn compared to other programming languages. And so Java is one of the more popular languages for students to learn. Later on in your career, if you go into computer science, you'll be learning a lot of other languages as well. And then lastly, like a lot of things these days, it's free on the internet. You can download the compiler from Oracle, and you can download the IDE from Eclipse, and it doesn't cost you anything. In the old days, they did charge you for all those things. So what is a GUI application? Okay, GUI, it really stands for Graphical User Interface. And what it does is it allows you to interact with objects on the screen. All right, and when you interact with those objects on the screen, we say that it is event-driven. All right, compare that to some of the programs that you wrote in the Intro to Java class, where you use the scanner object. Right. The difference is when you hit the scanner object line, the program simply stopped and it waited for the user to enter information. Nothing happened while it was waiting. In an event-driven program or a GUI application, what happens is that the program continues to run. You could have things moving all over the screen waiting for the user to interact. And when they interact, we call that an event. If they click the mouse, if they move the mouse, if they press a key on the keyboard, those are all events. And the computer sits and listens for those things to happen. All right, and because the programs have an event-driven nature to them, it allows programmers to work on small parts of the program separately. So I can create the user interface with all my buttons and everything on the screen, and then I can just make one button at a time my project. All right, I don't have to worry about the fact that the other button isn't working. All I have to do is focus on that one small part of the program. It makes it easier to write. And then the last thing is that programmers use methods that can be reused. All right, so if I'm in a GUI application and I have a method that works for one button, Well, maybe another button does something similar. I can then use that same method. Or maybe I want to use that same method in another program. I can simply copy and paste it. So the use of methods allows it to be transportable. It saves me time in the long run. And that kind of leads us into object-oriented programming. And object-oriented programming is some of the things I just mentioned. But for this course, we won't be writing a lot of our own objects like we did in Intro to Java. Instead, what we're going to be doing is using a predefined set of controls. All right, and these controls are in the Java Swing library, and we'll be learning how to use those. So mostly what we're going to do is work on, okay, what are the different properties and what are the different methods for all of these controls. It's similar to something we call an API. What an API is a predefined set of programming tools that you use to create a program. All right, and just like we learned in Intro to Java, we'll be learning how to use the properties which define the state of the object, like the color and the size and the position. All right, those are all properties. They don't do anything, they just describe the object. And then we have the methods. Those are the actions. Those are the things that define what the object can do. All right, and your job will be writing more methods than it will be actually creating unique objects. And then you'll have to learn to recognize and use those properties and methods and how you can apply them to all different types of situations. All right, so before we get started, just a few quick little rules reviews. All right, you should know this because the requirement for the class is that you already know Java. Okay, you know that Java requires perfection. You forget a comma, you add an extra space, you do something wrong, nothing works at all. So remember that as you're typing your code, you can't make typos. All right, Java is case sensitive. Java does ignore white space. That means you can put as many blanks and press enter as often as you like. In fact, what we want to do is structure our code so that it's easy to read. All right, easier it is for you to read, it's easier to find mistakes. All right, and trust me, we'll all be making plenty of mistakes. All right, use curly braces to create blocks of code, and when we create those blocks of code, we want to make sure that we indent inside each of those blocks of code. All right, all Java statements end with a semicolon. Now, some people get carried away with the semicolon. Remember that if it's the beginning of a loop, we don't put a semicolon at the end of a while loop. We don't put a semicolon at the end of a for loop because there's a block of data afterwards. So if you have curly braces after some statement, right, you don't use a semicolon. But if it's just a single line statement, then you do put a semicolon at the end. And then lastly, it's important, but Eclipse will take care of it for us. Java classes must have the same name as the file name. So what you have to be aware of is you can't reuse those names. Right? That's important. If you try to use a name that's already been used somewhere else, it might cause problems in your program. All right, so we're going to go ahead and create a small little program right now. You'll be, like I said, you'll be surprised. It takes a lot of lines of code. But before we get started, we want to talk about, okay, what are the 3 things we have to do when we build a GUI application? The first thing is we're going to start with a JFrame. All right, it's really not that hard to make a JFrame. We'll make a blank JFrame appear in just a few lines of code. Then we have to add the controls. Those are the objects. Those are the buttons that we're going to add, the labels on the screen. Once again, a little more lines of code, has some different things that we haven't done yet. And then the last thing is we're going to write the methods that make the controls work. All right, so here's the little simple program we're going to make. I'm going to open up Eclipse pretty soon. You might want to open it up right now just to get a head start. But we're going to create this simple little JFrame sample. All right, we're going to make the sample. It's called My First JFrame. All right, we'll put a label in blue that says My First JFrame, or My First Program. And then we'll put a button on there. And then when you click on the button, what will happen is the background color will change. So it's not a very fancy program, but it will be able to demonstrate how things work. So go ahead, if you haven't already, go ahead and open up Eclipse. And so here I have Eclipse open, and I have lesson 1 through 5. We created those in an earlier lesson. And when you expand lesson 1, we have a source folder. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on that source folder, and then we're going to go up to the new button and create a new package. If you're new to Eclipse, you'll get used to it. Most of us have already used this many times. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a My First JFrame package. Package is just a container, a folder that holds all of our files for this program, right? So go ahead, and once you have that, notice I did start with a lowercase letter because it is a file, it's a variable name, and so I'll click finish, and now I have a My First JFrame. Now you can see I've done all the assignments for lesson 1 already, so for each of the assignments that you complete, you'll also be creating a new folder, a new package folder. All right, once we have that package folder selected, then I'm going to create a new class. And once I make that new class, I'm just going to give that class a name. And we remember from our rules that class names start with capital letters. And so I'm going to type in My JFrame. Just like that with the capital letters. The only thing that has to be done is you really should put a capital M here. And then JFrame is usually written with a capital J and a capital F. All right, and go ahead and hit finish. And now you can see here's the beginning that Eclipse has done for us. Now some of you may have already checked the box that added the main method, but I usually leave that off and add it later. I am going to double click on the tab here, so that way it maximizes it. I have very limited space on my screen, so you can do whatever you want. Your computer probably has more room. All right, at the top of all of our assignments, we want to put in our name. So up at the top, put a single line comment and type your name. On the next line, put today's date. Okay. On the third line, what we're going to do is we're going to put in the assignment description. And this is lesson 1. And this is a first JFrame example. Right? So on all your future assignments, you'll do the same thing. Up at the top, you'll put your name, you'll put today's date, and you'll put a description. Sometimes the description might be a couple lines long, but just as long as we know which assignment is and what is the example. So we might have problem 1-1, problem 1-2, and then the next line might be a description of what is there. Okay. All right. We'll go down to the line between package and the class declaration where it says public class My JFrame. I'll press enter a couple times, and for a JFrame we have to import 3 different things. So I'm going to import java.awt.asterisk. All right, and then a semicolon. What that means is we're going to import what is called the Abstract Windows Toolkit. All right, so to make all of our JFrames and everything, we have to have the Windows Toolkit. So now all those elements, all those classes that are available in that folder are accessible to me for the program. Right? And I also have to import java.awt.event.asterisk. Right? So this is going to be all the events. And we mentioned that it's an event driven, so I have to have the events. And then the last thing are all of our controls. So I'm going to import javax.swing.asterisk. And that is all the swing controls that we'll be learning to do in this course. So for every program we write here, we'll start with those 3 imports all the time. All right, the next thing that we'll change is we'll change the class. And what we're going to do is we're going to inherit something. Now, we haven't really learned about inheritance yet, but just know that I want to be able to do everything that a JFrame can do. My JFrame is a JFrame. And so what we do is we always type after public class My JFrame, we type extends JFrame. So now what I have done is I have defined My JFrame is a JFrame. So everything a JFrame can do, My JFrame can do without my having to write any new code. Okay. All right, the next step, I'm just going to put a comment right now at the top, and I'll come back and fill this in later, but this is where my controls and objects. are going to be initialized. So we put those up at the top, and we put those before the main method. Right? These are what we call global variables. Right? We can use them all throughout our entire class. So I put them outside the methods. Then I'm going to put my main method, and I like to mark things with comments, and we all know it's the same main method we've always used, public static void main string args. Notice how I put my semicolon or my curly braces. I like to line them up so I can easily tell, okay, where do they begin, where do they end. And you can see that also if you put your cursor right after a curly brace and then look straight up, and you'll eventually run into the corresponding open curly brace. In this case, there's a little rectangular box around it. Same thing is true if I click after the open curly brace, it will show me the closed curly brace. All right, your programs are going to get pretty long in this class, and so indenting and matching up those curly braces will be very important. All right, so be careful as you're going along. All right, and only thing is, our main method for this program or this class, our main methods will always be really short. In fact, they're pretty much just, if I can type, all right, they're one line long. They just say make a new myJFrame, right? And we know that from our studies in Intro to Java, that really meant that we were calling the constructor. And the constructor was usually written for us in another program. And we're going to actually keep it all in one program for this class. We won't be writing extra side programs. So once again, it'll get a little long, but remember, we're just going to have the class inside, or the constructor inside the class. So now I'll go ahead and put the constructor. So remember, it started with the word public, and it does not have a return type. So we just put the name, and then we put the parentheses. If I was going to pass something into my constructor, I'm going to move this up the screen a little bit. If I was going to put something inside the constructor or pass to it, I would put it in the parentheses. But it's just public myFrame. Now you notice it's underlined, right? And the reason it's underlined is that that's not the name of the class. The constructor has to have the exact same name. So I made a mistake here, right? But that's how you learn how to program. You make a mistake and you try to fix it. And notice that I realized that, oh, it needs to be the exact same name as the class. So I had to put myJFrame. And we're going to go ahead and just build our frame. That was our first step. So I'm going to set the title. And on the title will be my first JFrame. And then we'll set the size of the window. And I'm going to set the size to be 400 by 200. So it'll be a rectangular size, right? Then the next thing I have to do is I'm going to set the background color to white. And so I'm going to use a method called getContentPane dot, and then set background, and then I'm going to put in a color white. All right, so that's a new line. We haven't used this getContentPane, but what that means is we are calling basically the object's frame when we say getContentPane. And then we're saying the frame is going to have this background color, and then color is the class, and white is a constant, and so we type it in all capital letters, but it's a constant property of the color object, so it's a static property. We don't change that property. It's kind of like math.py, the same way. And then our window won't show up unless we put in this line, which is set visible true. All right, so there we have completed our first task, and our first task is to make a window. And so I'll go ahead and I'll save it, and now I'll go ahead and I'll run it, and then up here off my screen I'll drag it down into view, but there is my first frame. I have the minimize, the maximize, the close box. I have nothing inside my content pane just yet, but I did change it to white. All right, it probably would have appeared a light gray if I hadn't changed that color. In fact, if yours is light gray, you might have an error on this line of code. So check your code carefully, make sure that it worked out correctly. Now I do have a little problem here in that when I click this X, I'll go ahead and close the box, and it looks like I've closed it. But what's happened is that the window has disappeared. However, in my computer's memory, that program is still running. And so if I run it and I test it and I test it and I test it and I do this over and over, eventually I'm going to use up all the memory in my computer. My computer's going to get really slow. So I have to add one more line of code so that when it closes, it not only closes, but it exits out. And to do that, I'm going to use this set. And it's called set default close operation. And I'm going to say for the JFrame dot and exit on close. And notice I'm going to take advantage of the content on content assist, because the computer recognizes, or Eclipse recognizes, that he probably wants exit on close, and in fact that is what I want. And now it really won't make any difference to you. You won't see it right now, but I guarantee you if you were sitting there running your code and testing it all day, eventually your computer would start getting really slow, because you would have 50 to 60 little programs running that he will chew up enough memory to slow down your machine. So now when I close it, it actually is gone from memory and I'm back running at full speed. Okay, the second part of building a GUI application is that we have to now add the different controls. And to add the different controls, I first have to go up to the top of my program, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to declare those different objects, control objects. And I do that by typing public static, then this is called a JLabel, and I'm just going to call it label equals a new JLabel, and then inside parentheses and quotes, I'm just going to put my first program. So I've created a label. Labels just words, and those labels can be used later on and placed on the page. We also need to create our button, so I'm going to put in public static JButton. I'll just call it button equals a new JButton, and once again inside parentheses and quotes, all right, I'm going to put in some text that says click here, so they know to click on it. I put my semicolon at the end. And then to modify what it looks like, I'm going to create a font object. So I'm going to public static font, and I'll just call this my font equals a new font, and inside quotes I'm going to use the Arial type font. Now you can use any font that is currently on your system, but Arial is one that is common of all computers. All right, and then I'm going to type in font with a capital F dot, and then I want it to be bold. Notice how when I hit the dot, the Content Assist came open and it showed me my different choices. And then I'll put a comma, and now I'll put the size, and I want a 24-point font. And then put your semicolon and press enter. And so there are our different controls. We've created them in memory. Now we have to place them on the page. And with the JFrame, there are several different layout managers that we will learn to use. But the one we'll use for this class has got a funny name. It's called the Grid Bag Layout. Think of a spreadsheet in cells where you have rows and columns. All right, that's basically what Grid Bag Layout is. And so we have to set that, and we type get content pane. Okay, remember that's the working area inside of our window frame. Dot set layout, and then we have to give it a layout manager, which is a new grid bag layout. Okay, so that's our layout manager, is the grid bag layout. And I'll put a comment there. Set layout manager. There's several other ones you use, but that's the one we're going to use for this class. It's really probably the easiest one to use. Next thing we'll do is we're going to put in the what's called a grid bag constraint. So we'll set the grid, and we'll give the grid a name, and that grid, it's called the grid bag constraints. And we can call it anything we want, but I like to call it my grid, simple short name, equals new grid bag constraints. Now we know that Java requires perfection, so if you end up with an error like I did there, right, what did I do wrong? I misspelled constraints, so I have to put an S. Right, so you shouldn't have anything underlined in red when you're doing this project. Now I'm going to place the label on the page, and to do that I'm going to take my grid and set the grid X. In other words, the X location. The X location goes across like an XY coordinate, and the first column is column 0. And then I'm going to go to my grid, and I'm going to select grid Y and put it at 0. So 0, 0, just like on a spreadsheet, that would be up in the top corner, the top left corner. After I have that set, I'm going to take my label, and I need to set the font. And the font that I'm going to set is my font. Remember, from up at the top, we created a font object called my font. So now the text that we wrote that says my first program is Arial. It's bold and it's 24 point. But we'd also like to make the color of it blue. So I'm going to say label dot set foreground, and foreground means the text color, and I'll put in color, and this time I'll put in blue. Now notice that you can put lowercase letters as well, but once again I made a mistake. You got to spell label right, and so there I have my label done correctly. So I have everything the way I want it. I have my label, okay, I know where I'm going to put it. I have the font, I have the color blue. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to place it on the page. So I use that get content pane method again, and I add a component. And the component I'm going to add is the label, and the constraint is my grid. Alright, so let's save it, and if we did it correctly, now I bring that into view, and there's my label, my first program, 24 point, bold and blue. Alright, and it's placed, the only thing on the page right now is centered on the screen. Let's go down a couple lines, and we will place the button on the page. Alright, and so to place the button on the page, I'll use a similar process that I used before. I'll set my grid dot grid X equals 0. So it'll be right on the same thing, same column, but my grid dot grid Y is going to be set in row number 1. So 0, 1, it'll be one row below. Then I'll take the button and I will set the font, and the font is my font. And then we'll do the button and we'll set the foreground, and we'll set the foreground, in this case, to the color red. And now let's put the button on the page. Get content pane dot add, and the control I'm going to add is the button, and I'll add it to the grid constraint, my grid. All right, so there we've placed the button on the page. So we'll save it and we'll run it. And now I'll come up here and grab my window, and notice that it now says my first program, and click here. So I have finished the user interface. I've added the label, I've added the button. Now what we need to do is to write the method or the action listener so that when I click on the button, it changes the background. So we're going to go ahead and write a method to do that. So I'll go ahead and close this. I'll go down a little further. Now there's a couple of ways you can do this. If it's a relatively short program, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write the code directly on the screen. All right, I'm just going to write it the whole thing. But if it's going to be a long method, I'm going to break it off and put it into a separate long method. This one's relatively long, and so I'm going to go ahead and just write one line of code, one big line of code that will call another method, and in that other method will change the background color. So this is how I call the method to change background color using an event listener. All right, and so to do that, I'm going to take the button and I'm going to add an action listener. All right, and the action listener that I'm going to do is a new action listener. Okay, now notice where the cursor is when I'm done typing that. All right, it's right after the first set of open and close parentheses. I'm going to go ahead and press enter. My automatic typing helper kicked in. I'm going to press enter, and I'm going to put the cursor right underneath the B. All right, and then I'm going to put an open curly brace and a closed curly brace. So this is going to be a big long line. Don't worry about the error right now. What it needs to do is the action listener needs a method. And so I'm going to type public void action performed. And the action performed method takes in an action event E. And then I put the cursor after that, press enter, put an open curly brace and a closed curly brace, and you can see this is really one big long line. Might sound difficult, but trust me, you'll get used to it because this is a line that you'll type frequently. All right, so it's sort of like writing main. The first time you had to write main, you didn't know what it was. You'll learn this one pretty well. All right, so we have the action performed. Somebody clicked on the button. And because they clicked on the button, now what I have to do is I have to say, what method do I want to run? All right, and I'm going to put this, I'm going to say button and listener action performed. And I'm going to send it E. You might think, okay, that's a really long name. But you do want to use descriptive names because in some programs you could have many different methods. And so later on, when I have a program that has multiple methods, I need names that are a little longer. In this case, it's very descriptive. The button has a listener, and when you performed an action on it, something was carried out. And so I'm going to go down below the constructor, and this is the end of the constructor on that line. And now I'm going to put the button action formed method. Okay, so let's go ahead and put our method public void. It's not going to return anything. It's going to be called button listener action performed, and it takes in an action event E. I know, you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of typing, but you'll get used to it. And for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically pick a random number. So I'm going to say int, and now I'm going to say this is an integer, we'll call it random number, and that's going to equal, and remember doing this before, we want to take it an integer, and then math.random times 5. We'll have 5 different background colors that we'll do. So there I've created my 5 different colors. And next, I could do this with an if statement, but this would be a good example of using the switch statement. So I'm going to go ahead and type switch random number. The reason I'm going to use a switch statement here is that the only thing it could possibly be are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this works well to put my case statements in. So case 0, and in this case I'm going to say if you say 0, we're going to get the content pane, and we're going to set the background color. The first color we'll set it to is a light blue, so I'll type color dot cyan, and then I'll put in my break statement so it doesn't change it to any other color. Then I'll put in my case 1 and then get content pane dot set background, and we'll put color dot, and let's put in light gray, and a break statement. And then case 2, get content pane and let's put in yellow as our color. And we'll put case 3, and let's do orange. And we'll finish off with white. And because there really is no other option, I don't need a default. But there I have my switch statement done, and actually I'm all done with my program. I've got everything done, all my errors are cleared up. Go through and just double check. All right, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this. I'm going to run it, and I'll have my program up here. Here's my program. I have my first program. I have click here. All right, this time when I click here, it will randomly pick a number from 0 to 4. All right, it could very easily pick white again, but it might pick yellow, or pick yellow again. It picked white. It picked cyan. It picked orange. It picked light gray. There you can see my program is working, and all the different colors are changing. So that's basically it on creating a short little program. I know it took a little longer to make, and it does take that long to write. Let's look real fast at the different assignments that we have for this class. All right, and first of all, what you'll need to do is to go ahead and read through the lesson. There's about 40 pages for you to read. A lot of it's review of what we just talked about, but go ahead and read that and then enter the code as they give you examples. And I know it can be a little tricky trying to figure out where it all goes, but only enter the code that applies to the stopwatch application, like what you see down here at the bottom. All right. Don't copy and paste. The temptation is to do that, but if you copy and paste, it might not give you any mistakes, but I guarantee you, you're not going to learn it. Actually type it, and it's good if you make a mistake. So go ahead and go through. If you make a mistake, try to fix it right away. You want to test it and debug it, test it and debug it as you're going. Add something, see if it works. As you can see, this program has quite a few more items that you're going to be adding. So add one at a time and then test it and see how it looks. All right, then read through the Java review. There's a little bit more of a Java review than I covered. You should already know all of it, but just in case, it's always a good time to double check. All right, and then when you've created your final version of the stopwatch application, go ahead and submit that as your first assignment. Okay. Then at the very end of the chapter on page 1-41, there are 4 short problems, and you saw I had them already done. And this is all that they look like. They're really simple. It's just a little program where you put a button on there, and when you click on it, the computer beeps or makes a sound. All right. The next one is when you click on it, it changes the text on the button. And it'll say click here, and it'll say click again. It'll say whatever you want it to say, but just make it change the text when you click on the button. The third one asks you to put 2 different buttons on the page, one of them enabled and one of them disabled. And when you click on the first one, it should disable the first one and enable the second. And then vice versa. When you click on the second one, it should disable the second one and enable the first one back to this original position. And finally, the last one requires you to go out on the internet and find out some information about how do you display the date. And so there's a little hint in the assignment, but all you need to do is put a button and a text box or a text field. All right, and when you click on it, it will show the date. So you can see when I created this, the date was December 27th, 2016. All right. It should show whatever the current date is when you click on the button. All right, so every time you click on it, the date might be different if you click on it on different days. So go ahead and get busy on this. You should be able to finish most of this in about 1 week's time. It will take a while to go through and create the savings calculator. Once you have that done, these programs are fairly simple. Took me about 15 minutes for each one. If it takes you a half hour or 45 minutes for each one, once again, you should be able to get it done in a week or week and a half. And then we'll have a test on lesson number 1 when you've finished all the different problems. So have fun.